Hey, folks, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained Threats to the Israeli Regime Edition. Uh, so, I'm making this video because there's just a lot of news about a redirected attempt by the Netanyahu government to undermine some of the main elements that make up a democratic regime, whether it's freedom of the press, whether it's freedom of speech, whether it's the independence of the judiciary, whether it's holding the representatives of the government accountable under the law. All those things are happening at the same time, which can't be a coincidence. There's probably some inspiration here from kind of measure we've seen from Trump of trying to sort of overwhelm the news with a lot of different things at the same time. So, being mindful of that, let's try to unpack a little bit of what's been going on over these last couple of days because I'm certainly quite concerned about it. So, what made me want to make this video is something that Shlomo Kari, the Minister for Communications, said today. He said in an interview today, first of all, that the Supreme Court should be abolished because it believes that it's above the law. Then I saw on the Israeli news on Channel 12 that in closed discussions, Karhi had said, quote, "We're representatives elected by the public. We can change the regime if we so wish." So there's a consciousness of an attempt to change the Israeli regime by some of the ministers. I don't think that was a slip of the tongue, so I'll try to build my case on why I think this wasn't a slip of the tongue. So here's some legislation that is currently moving forward. The same Shlomo Karhi, the Minister of Communications, and a very controversial Israeli member of Knesset called Tali Gottlieb, who some people have compared to sort of being the Israeli Marjorie Taylor Greene. They have a law moving forward calling for the privatization of the Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation, Kan, which used to be Channel 11, used to be the main government channel. When I was a kid, it was the only channel in Israel. Now they're privatizing it, which would mean taking it out of the control of the government, which would seem to be taking away control from the government. But that channel, which has been established since the late 1960s, has been a reservoir for what the government sees as left wing opinion. So they're hoping to privatize it and put it in the hands of owners, hopefully from their perspective, who share their political beliefs. Something that's already happened with Channel 13, which was left leaning, moved over to right leaning owners, and now is perhaps shifting in that direction. So the aim is to put the Khan Broadcasting Corporation, the public broadcasting corporation, on the chopping block to have it open for bids and privatize it if no one buys it. At the same time, the government is punishing the left-leaning newspaper Haaretz um, after their owner, Amos Shokin, came out and said that terrorists fighting against Israel are freedom fighters. The editorial board of the newspaper disavowed that, but they're still using this as a reason to punish the newspaper. What they're doing is they're forbidding anyone in government from having a subscription. Just about every government office, every embassy in the world that Israel has a subscription because Haaretz gives you high quality news that no one else does. No one in the government is allowed to advertise in there. So basically, they're cutting all ties with Haaretz, not banning it from speaking, not cutting their freedom of the press, at least not yet, but doing so. Um, I think that what Shokin said is just an excuse. If you look at Israeli media today, you'll see that no one is reporting what's happening in Gaza in a serious way. They might report that what the IDF is doing in Gaza. They might report that maybe some citizens are unhappy with Hamas or that aid is being stolen. But what they're not really reporting on is how many civilians are dying, how they're dying, accusations of various war crimes, etc. Those things aren't covered in much of the Israeli media because there is concern over backlash from viewers, subscribers, and the government. And Haaretz has stood out in that regard uh, in terms of publishing what's going on in Gaza. Um, so I think that's one of the reasons. And we saw something similar happen a couple of weeks ago with the member of Knesset, Ofer Kasif. Ofer Kasif was a radical left wing member of Knesset, signed a petition calling on South Africa to find Israel guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity against the Palestinians. He was suspended from the Knesset for 6 months for saying that. Now, I don't agree that Israel's committing genocide, but I do think that a member of Knesset, member of parliament, should have the ability to say so. It's the mark of a free society, and it's another indication of people cracking down on freedom of speech. Now, we've already mentioned Tali Gottlieb, who's passing legislation with Shlomo Kari to privatize government media. She's also involved in trying to pass a law that will forbid investigations into members of Knesset regarding any criminal activity, but also regarding any civil lawsuits. Only if 90 members of the Knesset, that's out of 120, prove of a specific investigation, will it be launched. That opens the road to investigations against sort of radical left members of Knesset that are unpopular, but certainly not anyone in the coalition who will easily be able to block 90. That would mean a massive majority, three-quarters of the Knesset to do so. So basically, members of Israeli law enforcement have told Channel 12 that if this happens, there basically won't be any investigations to anyone in the government. It will kill them all. Gottlieb has a conflict of interests in promoting this. She's being sued for $715,000 by the left-wing activist Shikma Breslev, who she accused of helping Hamas, being associated with Hamas, with absolutely no foundation. So this will help her with her own lawsuit, and it will certainly help Netanyahu and many others in the government who are accused of corruption and may be accused of corruption in the future. Meanwhile, Yariv Levin, the architect of the judicial reform that weakened Israel significantly in the months leading up to October 7th and tore the country apart, has said the time has come to provide full support for the restoration of the judicial and law enforcement systems. He's been saying this for a while. There's more support now. How much support? It's unclear if he has enough to move forward, but that's an initiative that he's trying to put forward. Meanwhile, Netanyahu is upset that members of his prime minister's office are being investigated for stealing confidential documents and leaking them to foreign press against the censorship laws of the state of Israel in a way that the prosecution is going to claim jeopardizes the security interests of the state of Israel. Netanyahu, who at first denied having any connection to the suspects, now came and said that the main suspect is a great patriot and a wonderful man and would never commit these things. And he said in a 9-minute video that he recorded, this indictment was filed against them, but its purpose is clear, to harm me and to harm you, the millions of Israeli citizens who support the policy I am leading on your behalf. And he called it a witch hunt. Um, the the institutions that were conducting the investigation are the Israeli police and the Shin Bet, the Shin Bet being the internal organization that runs intelligence in um, Gaza, runs intelligence in the West Bank, and is an instrumental part of the war there. And um, we're also seeing something else. Itamar Ben Gvir, the head of the police, is now approving the use of stun grenades against demonstrators. So if all these measures are demonstrated against, then the police will have the authority to use more brutal force to bring these demonstrations under control. This is an alarming trend. And it's something that we're seeing globally. We have governments that commit crimes, they legislate to make sure that they're not held accountable. Then they commit more crimes. Then they destroy law enforcement institutions and courts in order to commit more crimes. Um, that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing an intentional move and not a new one. This was going on before the war to undermine law enforcement system. And in this case, since we're talking about the Shin Bet, also the security apparatus that's keeping Israel safe during a war and weaken it at a strategic moment. I think it's very important to remember that very often authoritarian moves succeed when there's war because that's when the citizens rally behind the government and are expected to be united. And then freedoms are often taken away. And once freedoms are taken away during a war, they're usually not restored. Okay, I have a few questions from um, the video I made just a day ago. So I will try to answer them to my best ability. Friend of the show, FRDZ4KB, you should really tell us your name, asked, can you explain to me why so many Israelis think they can get away with not allowing a Palestinian state, while at the same time not giving millions of Palestinians any right, and not end up sanctioned and reviled like apartheid South Africa? If Israel continues on this path, we're one democratic administration away from Israel losing its protection in the UN Security Council, and Germany not protecting Israel's access to EU markets forever either, if there is no one who will give on the Palestinian issue. A large part of the world is already there. I really don't get it. Yeah. So this is a complex issue and a complex answer, but I will try to give a relatively short one. There's a lot of people in Israel who are very concerned about this. They're not in power, or most of them are not in power. What you have is a coalition of people who I would typify their approach to this problem in the following way. Some of them believe that God will provide whatever happens that the international community does. God will save Israel from any ramifications. That's Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and to some extent the Orthodox parties represent that school of thought. There's another school of thought, which is very wide in Israel, which is that the world is anti Semitic anyway. Regardless of what Israel does, Israel will always be singled out according to this approach. So it doesn't matter what Israel does. So what they'll tell you is that even if Israel did give a Palestinian state, the end result would be the same. Israel would be ostracized in the same way. There's a grain of truth, more than a grain of truth, to the fact that the international system um, tends to gang up on Israel. But they're incorrect that it doesn't matter what Israel does. It matters. Israel is singled out, and that means that when it does bad things, it pays a bigger price. That doesn't mean that what it does doesn't matter. Roberto Eliascals, I hope I said that right, asked, why do you think that if Trump orders to freeze the accounts and credit cards of the prosecutor and other members of the ICC, it won't make them stop their shenanigans? Well, I'm sure that if the US sanctioned the ICC, it would hurt the ICC. But they don't have American um, bank accounts and credit cards, or at least those aren't their major credit cards and bank accounts, because the US is not a member. And the US has made very clear that they're hostile to the ICC in various ways. All the administrations, Democrat and Republican. The only difference is who's more hostile. Republicans are more hostile. Democrats haven't really played ball with the ICC. They're just not willing to sanction it. So I think that the ICC independently operates from the US. And since they have over 120 member states, that's enough place for them to operate. And that includes all of the EU. So, in order for the United States to make sanctions more effective, they would have to convince the EU, Australia, Japan, a lot of other countries to cooperate with them. That's not going to happen, most likely. I think that the Trump attempt to try to force countries in the world to stop having ties to the ICC, which they view as a important legal body that is out to stop crimes against humanity, is doomed to fail. Most countries will not want to participate in that, and it will sour relations. I don't think Trump will take that too far. I think he might put sanctions on from the United States, but I think the bullying of other countries, I think that will be symbolic. If it's not, if he somehow manages to get the EU to turn as well, that's a different story. I just don't believe that's going to happen. Finally, ADV Jacko asks, since when are countries at war responsible for the well-being of the other country's civilian population? Am I getting something wrong? Yes, you definitely are getting something wrong. International humanitarian law covers any war at any time, regardless of who started it, regardless if it's just or not just. And according to international humanitarian law, you are constricted in how you run your war. So you have to make every attack proportional in the sense that you can't kill more civilians than the military necessity requires. Every attack has to have military necessity, so you can't just attack civilian infrastructure. Attacks need to be proportional. Attack there needs to be a lack of cruelty in attacks. There's all these different rules that every country in the world needs to follow when they're at war. A lot of them come from the Geneva Conventions, which are considered customary international law, which means that every country in the world is obligated to go according to them. Israel has said that it accepts the responsibility of the Geneva Conventions, but even if it hadn't, it would still be obligated to them. That applies to every state ever. There's states that violate this all the time, but they're violating international law. And this is the right thing to have. Every state that goes to war needs to be very mindful of the damage that it causes to innocent civilians. That is part of what makes this a better civilized world. And I believe something that we should continue promoting, whether it's good for Israel in a specific moment or not, it's good for all of humanity. And that also counts for something. That counts for everything, in my opinion. Okay. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. I'm working on a new episode of History of the Land of Israel podcast about how the kingdom of Israel fell. And I will see you here the next time something interesting happens.